All right, well, welcome. In this video, we're going to look at Revelation chapter 16. So in the previous video, we did 15, which deals with the Song of Moses, and we kind of dealt with that a little bit about how it sets the stage for Israel to be seen as the harlot. That's what the Song of Moses was, is that eventually she's going to become the harlot. And so when we get to 17, you'll see that's exactly what's unfolding. And in between the Song of Moses and where we get the snapshot kind of zoomed in on the harlot specifically, is chapter 16, where he goes through the different pouring out of the 7 bowls. So we'll look at those a little bit. I would say, though, if you go back and look at these, in some spots they're even word for word what the 7 trumpets were, right? And so you get to the end of the 7 trumpets, and all of a sudden John's taken away, and you see the woman giving birth to the son who's going to rule with a rod of iron, and the dragon tries to attack, and then you get this whole unfolding of then the 7 bowls, right? And so and you get the picture of the beast coming out and everything like that. So I think the best way to look at it is the 7 trumpets are covering the same ground that the 7 bowls are, right? So almost like Pharaoh, when he has this dream, he sees the 7 cows, good cows followed by 7 bad cows, and then he has a second dream. And it's not picking up at the end and chronologically going again. It's the same story told twice, right? Just from a slightly different angle. You get that in Genesis, where you get the creation story, then a second version of the creation story where it focuses more on Adam and Eve. And then in Pharaoh's story, he had the cow dream, then he has the dream of the wheat stalks. The good wheat stalks are followed by the bad wheat stalks. It's the same thing. And then Joseph says at the end of it, he says that this is a picture of showing that God is really passionate that he's going to do it, because he's shown you the same thing twice, right? That's what Joseph said. He said, Pharaoh, you've had the same dream. God showed you the same thing in 2 different ways. It's a way of God showing you he fully intends to do it. So then we get here to Revelation 16, and we're getting the 7 bowls, and it's very similar to what the wording of the 7 trumpets were. And like I said, after the 7th trumpet, John gets taken away again, he sees another dream. So I think what we're seeing is the 7 trumpets are a picture of God pouring out judgment on Israel, and that in that 7th trumpet, he says the mystery of God is fulfilled, which is the ending of the temple system and the birth of the church. And then he starts over. He says, he shows me another vision. And it goes all the way back to the woman giving birth to the one who's going to rule with a rod of iron, and the dragon trying to kill him. Now that's the birth of Jesus. So now we've started over again there, and we're coming forward, and now we get to the 7 bowls, and it's almost word for word the 7 trumpets. So I think it's 2 visions covering the same ground, right? Verse 1, it says, I heard a loud voice from the temple, we're in chapter 16, saying to the 7 angels, go and pour out the bowls of wrath of God on the earth. In verse 2, so I went and poured out his bowl upon the earth, and a foul and loathsome sore came among the men who had the mark of the beast and those who worshipped his image. Again, this is an area where the translators put that word earth in there, and it would probably be better translated, I think, as land. We've dealt with that quite a bit, but it really does change how you view this. Is Revelation a prophecy to Israel about things that are going to fall upon judgment on them because of what they did to the Lord and the ending of the temple system, or is this some cataclysmic thing that hasn't happened yet for the whole planet? And so if you've been watching these, you know where I fall on that. And I believe this should be translated or land. It's the same word, but the translators here, because this is viewed by many people as prophetic, have really, a deciding vote in how people read this. You put earth in there, then automatically people think, well, there's never been a time when the whole earth had this happen. But if you put the land in there, then immediately say, well, yeah, there's been a time when that happened to Israel. So I think this is a place where if you put the land, it really kind of zeroes in on what we're doing. Revelation 16:3. So again, in verse 2, we're dealing with the people who had the mark of the beast, which is what the trumpets were dealing with. Then bowl 2, the sea turns to blood. Then the second angel poured out his bowl on the sea, and it became blood as of a dead man, and every living creature in the sea died. So keep in mind, he's seeing a vision here. But one of the things that I think kind of fits with this is Josephus says that when Rome first came in to begin their attack, one of the things that happened is, over there on the sea, which this sea, when they're talking about this, talking about the Mediterranean Sea, over there is the port cities. So if you're wanting to leave and flee, that's where you would go. And the Roman army knew that. So they immediately sent a battalion, a regiment there to cut off the ports, right? Well, many Jews had already arrived at the ports and were leaving. And so Rome, with their ships and everything, went out and went to war with all these ships that had the Jews. They slaughtered all of them. But the battle itself took place in the sea. And so there were tens of thousands of Jews that were killed from those ships, and their bodies were in the sea. And so for weeks, even the Romans wouldn't even go anywhere near the coastland because there were so many rotten dead bodies that had washed up on shore, and the whole thing was filled with blood, and it was death everywhere. So that's a potential literal fulfillment of what he's seeing about how the sea has turned to blood. I also want to point out, verse 4, he says he poured out his bowl on the rivers and the springs of water, and they came like blood. If you go back to the trumpets, this section through here is almost word for word with the trumpets. Verse 6, he says, they have shed the blood of the saints and the prophets, and you have given them blood to drink, for it is their just due. So he's saying they're being judged for killing the saints and the prophets. That's an important marker for identifying what we're talking about here, because if you remember in Matthew 23, I'll just jump over there and read it for you. Matthew 23, verse 33. So this is Jesus talking. He says, so you also, when you see these things, know that it is near at the doors. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will no by means pass away. Was that 24? All right, I'm on 24. Let me go back to 23. All right. Matthew 24 is great too, but we're going to do Matthew 23. Sorry, it's on the wrong chapter. Matthew 23:33. Serpents, brood of vipers, how can you escape the condemnation of hell? Therefore, indeed, I send you prophets, wise men, and scribes. He's talking about Jerusalem now. He says, some of them you will kill and crucify. Some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that on you, talking about his generation of Jewish people there living in Jerusalem, that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Assuredly, I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. He's saying they are going to experience God's wrath and judgment for killing the prophets. So, in Revelation 16, verse 6, he says that these bowls that are being poured out is judgment for the ones who killed the prophets and the saints. So you put those two together, Jesus says that's for his generation. His generation, the Jewish people there that he's talking to in his generation, are going to be the ones that God holds accountable for the blood of the prophets and saints. So in Revelation 16:6, when it says that this bowl of wrath is for the killing of the prophets and the saints, then you should automatically put that into the first century, because Jesus said this generation will not pass away until the blood of all the prophets and saints has been judged. And so when Revelation 16 is saying this bowl is for judging the prophets and the saints, that's further identification that these events of Revelation are taking place in that first generation after Jesus, right? And I heard another from the altar saying, "Even so, Lord, mighty God Almighty, true and righteous are your judgments." And if you kind of look through these bowls, you go back in, you'll see that this is very similar to the trumpets. Let's look at 16 verse 10. It says, "The fifth angel poured out his bowl on the throne of the beast, and his kingdom became full of darkness." So we see a lot of the judgment during this time period falling on Israel, but he says this one is going to fall on the throne of the beast, right? Which is different than the harlot that we're going to look at later. The beast is clearly Rome. The harlot is clearly Jerusalem, but he's saying that there's going to be calamity for the beast as well during this time. And what you'll find historically is that during this few year window of this tribulation that they're going through, that things weren't all roses for Rome either, right? So on the one hand, Nero burns the city down practically. More than half the city burned up because Nero was trying to burn out the slums for a new big grand building project, and the wind took the flame through the whole city. That's what triggered a lot of this, was then he's looking for people to, a scapegoat, if you will, to blame. And he blames the Jews and the Christians. And that's when the great persecution of Jews and Christians throughout the Roman Empire begins, right? But then Nero kills himself, and then there's chaos in Rome, right? And there was all kinds of infighting, all kinds of chaos. Then Vespasian comes in. He was the one leading the attack on Israel at first, and during all the chaos, he leaves. So they have a little window of time. He leaves, comes back to assert his authority as Caesar, and during that, one of the things he did to kind of get everybody back in line is he intentionally cut off the food supply to the Roman capital city. That whole area there around Rome, he cut off all their food with the intention of starving them to death. That was his way of getting order back. I'll starve the whole area, and then when they're hungry and starving, then we'll deal with them, and bring order back in, provide some food, get everybody back on the same page. But all this infighting and resurrection, or insurrection rather, that was going on, he put a stop to it. So Nero dies and kills himself in 68. Vespasian takes over in 70. In that year of 69, between 68 and 70, it was total chaos. In fact, one of the wonders of the world was this big Jupiter temple there in Rome, and in all this chaos and civil war that's going on, that whole temple was destroyed. And so Rome itself, the city had been burned and was on fire. Their great temple that was the centerpiece of the whole city was destroyed and ruined. And so Rome itself is falling into absolute chaos too. So during this time, the Roman armies are bringing judgment on Israel, but the capital of Rome, the throne of the beast, is in absolute chaos too. And that's exactly what this is saying. He didn't say all the empire of Rome is being tormented here. It's just the throne area. It was just Rome, and that's pretty much what happened. So throughout the Roman Empire, it was the Jews and Christians that were being persecuted, but the actual city of Rome itself fell into absolute chaos. And so that's why he says, the mystery of, I think that's part of what he means by the mystery of what was, which was this great Roman Empire. Currently, it's chaos, but it will rise again. In order will be restored, right? All right. Verse 12 of 16 says, "The sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates. Its water was dried up, so the way of the kings of the east might be prepared." So that's an allusion, first of all, to how Babylon fell. Right? Later, you're going to see Jerusalem is called Babylon the Great. But the way that they destroyed Babylon was they dried up the river Euphrates, and then they marched right in. Babylon was a city on the river, so when they dried up the river went right through the city, and so the walls are all the way around. Well, when the river was blocked up further up the road, and the water level came down, then you get this big hole underneath the wall, and the army just marched right in and destroyed Babylon. So he's talking about drying up the river Euphrates. If you compare that back to Revelation 9, when we were in the trumpets, the fifth or the sixth trumpet is the drying up of the Euphrates. The sixth bowl is the drying up of the Euphrates. So I'm telling you, if you go back and do a little comparison between the trumpets and the bowls, it's almost word for word. And so I think that's further confirmation that this is the same vision, just being shown from two different angles, right? And so there in the trumpets, it talked about these spirits that were being held there, waiting on the right time. Here, it specifically says that it is also the army that's coming in that was over there at the Euphrates. And if you remember from that video, that's exactly what happened. The armies of Rome that ended up destroying Israel, many of them were stationed there at the Euphrates. And they marshaled their forces together over there and came in. And I think maybe God allowed that because that's also how Babylon came in to destroy Israel. And so it's almost like, all right, here we go again. You know, God's wanting them to see, hey, this is the same thing happening again. The temple is going to be destroyed. They're going to come in from the Euphrates, just like Babylon came in and destroyed Solomon's temple. The same thing's going to happen to Herod's temple, except this time it's going to be even worse. Right? And it was tremendously much worse. Even though Babylon came in and destroyed everything, they took a lot of prisoners, a lot of people were spared, and they just moved out and moved all over the place, but they were spared. Rome's a different animal. Rome came in and killed millions and millions of Jews between 68 and 70. And so, yeah, not just, 50,000 or so like Babylon. We're talking millions of Jews were killed between 68 and 70. All right. 16:15, he says, "Behold, I'm coming as a thief. Blessed is he who watches and keeps his garments, lest he walk naked and see my shame." When he talks about blessed is he who's kind of paying attention here and keeps his garments, that's just a little side thing that in that culture they would have understood what was being talked about. But what he means by that is in the temple guards, they had shifts where you would watch overnight, in case enemies were coming in and stuff. So if you were part of their military, that was just a normal thing. You'd often get night watch, and you'd have to stay awake all night. But they would shift that. It wasn't the same person each time. It was different people. So maybe your body doesn't get as used to it, So sometimes guys would fall asleep. And so if you were caught falling asleep, the first time you were beaten. The second time, they stripped you naked, burned your clothes as a way of, hey, wake up. It's not only shame, but it's a mental, hey, you're walking around naked. Everyone knows you fell asleep. It's a way of shame, punishment, getting the person's attention. So when he says, hey, keep watch, keep your garments, lest you walk around naked and they see your shame. That's what he's talking about. He's going the inference back to how the soldiers worked out of the temple. But the point he's saying is when you see these things happening, if you're a believer and you see Rome coming in and they're marshaling their armies at the Euphrates, you should leave. Jesus talked about that too. Telling people that when you see these things coming, don't even go back into your house to get your cloak or anything. Flee and run. Because Rome's not going to spare anybody that's still there. And so he's giving you fair warning. Hey, you should leave when you see these things happening. And so in verse 15, he's saying, behold, I'm coming as a thief. Now, I think the interesting part of that is often people quote that talking about like the return of the Lord at the very end for judgment. But many times in apocalyptic literature, Old Testament prophets, and I think in Jesus' teaching too, even though sometimes people mistake it, I think anytime Jesus talks about his coming, they automatically put it for the very end, final judgment or a rapture or something like that. But in the prophets, the coming of the Lord meant coming for judgment. Like God is coming when Babylon comes in and destroys the temple, or when the Assyrians come in, or when God allows Philistines to come in. It was often described as God's judgment through the enemy army. So God would say he's coming to execute judgment, but it was never the Lord showing up in his physical form killing them. It was always the army showing up. So when God says, I'm coming and I will execute judgment on you, it was never him in his physical body. So when he says here, behold, I'm coming like a thief, you need to be ready. In this context, he's not talking about his final return at the end of time. He's talking about judgment that has been declared, and it is God executing this judgment, but he's going to do it through the Roman army. Right? He says they gathered them together to the place in Hebrew called Armageddon. This is one that gets a lot of publicity in mainstream teaching, futurist teaching, the Battle of Armageddon. So it's talking about Megiddo in the Jezreel Valley, which is kind of the valley. Nazareth is one of the hills around this valley, and so it's kind of the area where Jesus would have grown up, is that Megiddo is the city in the valley. It kind of controlled the road that goes through that valley. A lot of stuff happened here. This is where Gideon fought the Midianites. This is where Saul and Jonathan were killed in the battle with the Philistines. This is where Jezebel and Ahab set up one of their royal cities was in Jezreel, which is in the valley just right across from Megiddo. Elijah calls down fire from the mountain at Carmel, and Megiddo is right at the bottom of Carmel. So a lot of stuff happens in this area, but there's really not, Har. It's Har Megiddo in Hebrew, which is the mountain of Megiddo. In English, we just run it all together, and it's called Armageddon, like that's a place, but it's not. It's two Hebrew words, Har and Megiddo. Har is the word for mountain, and Megiddo is an actual city there. And so it's the mountain of Megiddo is what it's actually saying, which that kind of throws some people off too, because there isn't a mountain of Megiddo, not really. Maybe Carmel up the hill there, where Elijah calls down fire from heaven. But really, I think what they're talking about is in that area there of the valley is where many different battles came through. The Romans came through that area too. So probably what we're talking about here is, a gathering of the Roman army on their way down to destroy Jerusalem, right? And so it's not, it doesn't, for all the talk of Armageddon, it doesn't have a lot of, if you just read it, there's not a lot that happens. You know what I mean? You get this, the army's kind of passing through there. There's a lot of slaughter that happens in that valley. But it was only a part of the Roman slaughter. So all the slaughter they did in the valley of Megiddo as they're coming way down, there was a lot of people died there. A lot of people lived in that valley. It was a beautiful place, but actually the more awful part, if you will, is when the army kind of then keeps going south and shows up at Jerusalem. But that whole area, the whole country was devastated by the Roman army. And let me give you a couple other things in this video. In verse 19, it talks about the city divided into three parts. So again, I don't know if I gave you this back when we were in the trumpets, but in Ezekiel chapter 5, verse 11 through 12, he talks about something similar to this. Ezekiel 5:11-12. It says, "Therefore, as I live, says the Lord, surely because you have defiled my sanctuary with your detestable things." So this is a prophecy against Jerusalem, but Solomon's Jerusalem, Solomon's temple and the destruction that was going to come on that. It's another repurposing, which you'll find as we go through this. I hope you're seeing that Revelation is really one of the most Old Testament books of the whole Bible, because it's drawing all these images from the prophets. So again, Ezekiel's picture of the destruction of Solomon's temple is the city being divided into three parts. So in this bowl being poured out, and it says the city is divided into three parts, that is coming back to Ezekiel's prophecy against Jerusalem. He says, "Because you have defiled my sanctuary with your detestable things and with your abominations, therefore I will diminish you. My eye will not spare you, nor will I have pity. 1/3 of you shall die by pestilence and be consumed with famine. 1/3 shall fall by the sword all around you, and I'll scatter another third to the winds, and I will draw out the sword after them." And so that idea of the city being divided into thirds goes all the way back to the destruction of Solomon's temple. And it wasn't so much an actual earthquake, it was just a way of saying everybody's going to suffer, but you're not all going to suffer in the same way. And then one other potential reference there to the dividing into three parts is we also know that literally when Jerusalem was being destroyed, the people broke up and they were following three different main messiahs, right, would-be messiahs, inside the city while they were being surrounded by Rome, and they were under siege and they couldn't get out. And it happened during Passover, so everybody's there, right? Or during the big feast, everybody's there, and something like 3.5 million people probably showed up, and so the whole place is packed on the inside, because you would never have that many people on the inside. So first of all, it was probably horrendous living conditions with that many people running to the inside of the city. But then on top of that, they divided up with these would-be messiahs, right? Each one, everybody's under siege, everybody's wanting to have hope that God's going to show up and overthrow Rome. This is our moment. And so different would-be messiahs rose up and said, "Listen, I've heard from God. We're going to just follow me, and we're going to defeat Rome." Well, the trouble is they had three of them that were doing it at the same time. And so different people were following different ones. And so the city divided into three groups. So that's another potential reference there. And then I also think it's kind of interesting, he talks about it being shaken into these three groups. I think Hebrews, when it talks about we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, is another reference. I think there's several references in the New Testament that kind of show they had all received this vision from John, and it was influencing the things they were writing. So when he says that, talking about the New Jerusalem and everything, and that we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, I think that's a possible allusion to this, where he says right before Jerusalem's destroyed, God is going to shake it, and it's going to divide into three parts. And then Revelation 16:20, and again, also let me just also reiterate that this is a vision. So when he says there's an earthquake that divides the city into three parts, it doesn't necessarily have to be a literal earthquake that snaps the city literally into three parts. That's often a very apocalyptic way of saying God is shaking them into three different parts. So in the same way that the Lamb doesn't mean there's going to be a farm animal on the throne in heaven. It's a vision. Same way here, that when he says there was a great earthquake and Jerusalem was divided into three parts, it doesn't necessarily mean that the land itself was split. It could be an apocalyptic way of saying that within the city they were split into three different groups. All right. And then verse 20, it says, interesting that verse 20 says, "Every island fled away, and the mountains were not found, and great hail from heaven fall upon men. each hailstone. Okay, so what I wrote here is that it's interesting that the Roman stones that were hurled at Jerusalem weighed about 1 talent, right, which is 100 pounds. So let's go back and read this. So what I'm getting at is Josephus said that in the attack, the Romans were hurling these white stones at the city. You know, they've got their catapults. And so when he says there's going to be hailstones falling down on the city that were about 100 pounds each, you know, people say, oh, what a catastrophe that, you know, there's never been a hailstone that big. Again, this is a vision. And so the vision is of hailstones falling down. But I think the reality was Rome has these catapults, and they were hurling these white stones at the city. And it says each one had the weight of about a talent. And that's what Josephus says. It said the Roman white stones were about 100 pounds, and that's about the weight of a talent. And so, again, that's further, I think, confirmation that what we're talking about is just this attack on Jerusalem. And that's exactly what Rome did. You know, during the siege, they didn't just sit back and hang out. Rome was active and busy. I mean, you got tens of thousands of, you know, between the soldiers, the engineers, and all the side people, you got 10, 15,000 people there trying to take this city, plus all the side soldiers that had come. So, I mean, you may have 30, 40,000 people there. They're not just sitting around doing nothing. So, you know, they had their siege engines, they had their catapults, and they'd be launching these stones in all day. And it's interesting, it says, men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, since that plague was exceedingly great. And so let me explain what that means in terms of like a real fulfillment. It says that they blasphemed God because of the stones that were being poured in. So from Josephus, we know one of the things that they were doing is the Jews didn't like Christians, and they didn't like the Christian message about Jesus, and that, you know, they knew that what had been taught there in Jerusalem about Jesus, and that the Son was going to return one day, and you know, and the Christians throughout Jerusalem were telling them, you have to be ready. The Son's going to return from the heavens, and so the soldiers on the wall in Jerusalem started mocking as the stones would come in. And their mockery of Christianity was their way of telling the city, watch out, here comes one of the stones. Because you'd want to hide, if at all possible. Even these things were heavy and they would blow walls up. But, you know, as they're coming in, the guards on the wall would let everybody know that they saw one and it's coming. And often they do it at night, so and they could see the white stone coming. But I heard, I think Josephus said that somewhere through the middle, they started painting the rocks black so that at night they wouldn't see them coming. Because at first they were white, you know, and they'd see them coming. So anyways, long story, even longer here. The guards on the wall, to be funny, would say, oh, it's the return of the sun. Here comes the sun. You know, speaking of, you know, blaspheming Jesus, right? And that was their way of letting the people know that one of the rocks was coming in and hide. You know, so as soon as they'd see it launched, they'd laugh and say, oh, here comes the sun. It's the return of the sun. And, you know, and people would know to hide. And so when he says that, you know, these hailstones were coming down and men blasphemed God because of the hailstones, I think that's a literal fulfillment of that they were mocking Jesus and the Christian message, that he was going to come back from the heavens one day for the church. And so when you'd see this rock coming down, they say, here comes the sun, everybody watch out, you know, and it was a mockery of Christianity. All right, so that's about all I got for 16. Even though I only touched on some of these a little bit, I do think we covered it more thoroughly when we did the trumpets, because a lot of this, in my opinion, is the same thing. It is the same story of the 7 trumpets that gets retold here through the 7 bowls. And then in 17, then we zero in again on a snapshot specifically of Jerusalem from the imagery of her being the great harlot. Okay? All right, well, let's pause there.